The rain in London didn't fall, it mourned. It was a rhythmic, relentless grey drizzle that blurred the edges of the Victorian architecture and turned the streets of Mayfair into a slick, obsidian mirror. Inside the offices of Sterling, Vance, and Holborn, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and old, expensive paper. Elias Thorne sat in a high-backed leather chair that felt more like a throne than a seat. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal grey suit, his fingers grazing the gold watch his father, Arthur, had given him on his 25th birthday. Arthur and Eleanor Thorne were dead, killed in a freak private jet accident over the Alps 3 weeks ago, and yet, Elias still felt their presence. He felt the weight of their expectations, the coldness of their perfection, and, most importantly, the massive shadow of their legacy. He was the only child. The golden boy. The heir to a pharmaceutical empire and a real estate portfolio that spanned 3 continents. To Elias, this meeting wasn't a question, it was a coronation. "Mr. Thorne? We are ready for you," a young paralegal whispered, opening the double oak doors to the main boardroom. Elias stood, smoothing his tie. He walked in with the practiced confidence of a man who had never known the word no, but as he stepped into the room, his stride faltered. The room wasn't empty. Seated at the far end of the long mahogany table was a woman. She looked like a smudge of gray ink on a pristine white page. She wore a cheap, sensible wool coat and sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was perhaps 30, with tired eyes and hair pulled back into a utilitarian bun. She didn't look like a socialite. She didn't look like a lawyer. She looked like someone who worked double shifts and worried about the price of eggs. Elias ignored her, assuming she was a clerk or a witness. He took his seat at the head of the table. "Mr. Henderson," Elias nodded toward the family's longtime attorney. "Can we get on with this? I have a meeting with the board of directors at 4. Marcus Henderson, a man whose face was a map of legal precedents and repressed secrets, didn't look up immediately. He polished his spectacles with a silk cloth, his expression unreadable. "Elias," Henderson said softly. "Please, sit. And I believe you haven't introduced yourself to Miss Sarah Miller." Elias glanced at the woman. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for a split second before she looked away. There was no greed in her gaze, only a profound, vibrating nervousness. "Is she a claimant?" Elias asked, his voice sharpening. "If this is about some distant cousin or a charitable trust, we can handle it through the executors." "She is not a claimant, Elias," Henderson said, finally putting on his glasses. "She is a beneficiary." The air in the room seemed to thin. Elias felt a slight, cold prickle at the back of his neck. "A beneficiary? My parents had a small list of servants and distant relatives." "Put her on the list. Now, read the will." Henderson sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He opened a thick manila folder and began the ritual. The preamble was standard: the declarations of sound mind, the funeral instructions, the distribution of minor personal effects to longtime staff. Elias waited impatiently, his foot tapping a silent rhythm against the plush carpet. Then, Henderson's voice changed. It became flatter, more formal. "As to the remainder of our estate, Henderson read, including but not limited to the property known as Blackwood Manor, the controlling interest in Thorne Global Holdings, all liquid assets, offshore accounts, and personal heirlooms." Elias leaned forward. This was it. The moment the world became his. "We hereby bequeath, in full and without condition, the entirety of said estate to Sarah Jane Miller." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a bomb goes off, the ringing in the ears, the vacuum of sound. Elias didn't move. He didn't breathe. He watched Henderson's lips, waiting for the correction. Waiting for the in trust for Elias Thorne or the except for the primary residence. "Run that by me again," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Henderson looked him straight in the eye. The entire estate, Elias. To Sarah Miller. You have been left a single, lump sum payment of £50,000, and the right to collect your personal belongings from the manor within 48 hours. Elias stood up so abruptly his chair crashed backward against the wall. The sound was like a gunshot. You're joking. This is a joke. Is this a test? Some final, twisted lesson from my father about the value of $1. He turned his gaze on Sarah Miller. She had shrunk back into her chair, her face pale as parchment. Who are you? What did you do to them? I don't know, Sarah whispered. Her voice was trembling. I never met them. I swear. I don't even know who they are. Don't lie to me. Elias roared, slamming his palms onto the mahogany table. Nobody leaves $100 million empire to a stranger they met on the street. What did you have on them? Was it blackmail? Did you find something in their past? Elias, sit down, Henderson commanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. I will not sit down. This is my life. This house has been in my family for 4 generations. My father built that company with his bare hands. Your father wrote this codicil 6 months ago, Henderson said, sliding a document across the table. It is notarized. It is ironclad. He and your mother visited me together. They were very specific. They said, and I quote, "We are finally doing what is right." Elias grabbed the paper. He scanned the signatures, his mother's elegant, flowing script and his father's sharp, aggressive scrawl. They were real. There was no mistaking them. What is right? Elias's voice broke. How is disinheriting their only son for a total stranger right? He looked back at Sarah Miller. She was shaking now, her eyes swimming with tears. She didn't look like a mastermind. She looked like a victim. I didn't ask for this, she said, her voice small but clear. I got a letter. I thought it was a scam. I came here because the lawyer said it was legal business. I work at a hospital, Mr. Thorne. I'm a nurse. I don't have any money. I don't know your parents. Then give it back, Elias snapped. If you didn't ask for it, sign it over. Right now. I'll give you £1 million and you can walk away and never have to work a day in your life. Sarah looked at Henderson, then back at Elias. Something changed in her expression. The fear was still there, but a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or a deep-seated sense of destiny crossed her face. They were so specific, Sarah said, almost to herself. Why would they do this to you? If they loved you, why would they leave it to me? Because they were insane. They were old and losing their minds. They were perfectly lucid, Elias, Henderson interrupted. In fact, your father told me that if you reacted this way, I should give you this. Henderson reached into the folder and pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope. Elias's name was written on the front in his mother's handwriting. Elias snatched it. He tore it open, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Inside was a single slip of paper with a handwritten note. Elias, do not hate this woman. Hate the lie we lived. If you want to know why she has our world, look for the year 1994. The truth is buried under the mountain. We are sorry. Truly. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. 1994. He was 3 years old that year. He remembered nothing but the blurry warmth of the manor and the smell of his mother's perfume. He looked up at Sarah Miller. She was standing now, clutching her worn handbag to her chest. I'm leaving, she said softly. Wait, Elias said, but the anger had left him, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. 1994. Does that year mean anything to you? Sarah paused at the door. She looked at him, and for the first time, Elias saw a reflection of his own pain in her eyes. "That's the year I became an orphan," she said. "My parents died in a car accident on a mountain road. I was the only survivor." She turned and walked out, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her with a soft, final thud. Elias stood in the center of the room, the will of his parents lying scattered on the floor like fallen leaves. He looked at the note in his hand. The truth is buried under the mountain. He wasn't the heir to a fortune anymore. He was the heir to a crime. And as the rain continued to beat against the windows of the office, Elias Thorne realized that his life hadn't just ended, it had never truly been his to begin with. The 48-hour countdown began not with a bang, but with the rhythmic, mocking tick of the grandfather clock in the grand foyer of Blackwood Manor. For the first time in his 32 years, Elias Thorne felt like a trespasser in his own home. Every oil painting of a stern-faced ancestor, every hand-woven Persian rug, and every silver candlestick seemed to shrink away from his touch, as if the house itself had already acknowledged its new mistress. He had 2 days to pack a lifetime of privilege into cardboard boxes. But Elias didn't pack. Instead, he retreated to his father's study, a room that smelled of expensive tobacco and secrets, and began to tear it apart. Before diving into the archives, Elias needed to see the enemy. He spent the first morning following Sarah Miller. He sat in his sleek, black Italian sports car, a vehicle that now felt like a borrowed suit, parked across from St. Jude's Hospital. He expected to see a woman celebrating her windfall. He expected to see her on the phone with real estate agents or sipping champagne. Instead, he saw Sarah Miller stumble out of the hospital entrance at 7:30 a.m., her face gray with exhaustion. She was still wearing her pale blue nursing scrubs, a cheap nylon backpack slung over one shoulder. She stopped at a sidewalk vendor, bought a coffee that she looked like she couldn't afford, and sat on a damp park bench for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. She looked utterly broken. "Why you?" Elias whispered to the windshield. "What did they see in you that they didn't see in me?" He followed her to a cramped apartment building in a part of London where the streetlights hummed with a sickly yellow flicker. There was no doorman. There were no security cameras. Just a rusted buzzer and the smell of stale cooking oil wafting from the ground floor kebab shop. This was the woman who now owned a pharmaceutical empire. It was absurd. It was offensive. By evening, Elias was back at the manor, fueled by 3 espressos and a cold, sharp anger. He bypassed the family's standard accounting software and went straight for his father's private server. Arthur Thorne was a man of meticulous habits, a man who believed that if you didn't record a transaction, it didn't exist. Elias spent hours navigating through encrypted folders and shell company aliases. He was looking for Sarah Miller's name, but it was nowhere to be found. No direct payments. No trust funds in her name. Then, he saw it. Deep within a folder labeled Charitable Diversions, 1994, he found a recurring monthly transfer. Every month, for 30 years, exactly £5,000 had been moved from Arthur's personal account to an offshore entity called the Altruist Trust. Elias dug deeper. The Altruist Trust had only one purpose: to pay the bills for a Sarah Jane Miller. He clicked through the sub-files, his eyes widening as the scale of the deception became clear. His parents hadn't just left her the estate, they had been ghostwriting her entire life. 1997, payment for private primary school tuition. 2005, full scholarship to an elite boarding school, anonymously granted. 2010, university tuition and housing. 2015, a random lottery win that covered Sarah's nursing school fees. They had watched her. They had curated her success from the shadows, ensuring she never wanted for the basics, yet never letting her know where the money came from. It wasn't a gift, it was a maintenance fee. Elias rubbed his temples, the note from the lawyer's office screaming in his mind, "The truth is buried under the mountain." He opened a browser and typed in a date, November 14, 1994. He added the keywords, Mountain Road, accident, Thorn. The search results for his parents were clean. On that date, Arthur and Eleanor Thorn were reportedly at a gala in Zurich. There were photos of them smiling, radiant, the power couple of the decade. But when he searched for accident and November 14, 1994 without his parents' names, the screen filled with a different story. Tragedy on the Simplon Pass, young couple killed in hit and run. A devastating accident occurred late Tuesday night on the treacherous mountain roads of the Swiss Alps. David and Mary Miller, both 28, were pronounced dead at the scene after their vehicle was forced off a cliff by an unknown driver. Their 3-year-old daughter, Sarah, was found miraculously alive in the wreckage the following morning, suffering from hypothermia. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at the photo of the wreckage, a crumpled silver sedan. Then, he pulled up his father's private travel logs from that same year. According to the official Thorn Global records, his parents were in Zurich. But according to a small, handwritten receipt Elias found tucked into an old passport sleeve, Arthur Thorn had paid a local mechanic in a small village near the Simplon Pass for emergency bodywork on a black Mercedes on November 15, 1994. Elias stood up, his legs shaking. He looked around the study. The mahogany walls, the leather-bound books, the gold leaf detailing. All of it felt different now. He realized that every luxury he had ever enjoyed, the private tutors, the summer homes, the very floor he was standing on, was built on the silence of that mountain road. His parents hadn't been doing what was right by leaving the money to Sarah. They were trying to vacate a crime scene they had been living in for 30 years. He understood now why Sarah Miller looked so tired. She had been robbed of a life, and his parents had tried to replace her mother and father with a checkbook. A sudden noise startled him, a soft thud from the hallway. Elias walked to the door and opened it. Standing there was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper who had been with the family since before he was born. She was holding a tray of tea, her eyes red and swollen. "Master Elias," she whispered. "I saw the lights. I thought you might need something." Elias looked at her, really looked at her. Mrs. Gable had been there in 1994. She had washed his clothes, tucked him in, and kept the secrets of the house. "Mrs. Gable," Elias said, his voice cracking. "Where were my parents on the night of November 14, 1994? Truly." The tray in Mrs. Gable's hands shook. The china teacups rattled like teeth. She didn't look at him. She looked at the floor, her silence more damning than any confession. "They told me never to speak of the rain that night," she whispered. "They came home with mud on their shoes and blood on their souls, Elias. And they spent the rest of their lives trying to wash it off." Elias returned to the desk. He had 24 hours left before the manor belonged to the daughter of the people his parents had killed. He didn't feel like an heir anymore. He felt like an accomplice. But there was one thing the note hadn't explained. If his parents were so consumed by guilt, why wait until they were dead to give it all back? Why leave him, their son, to deal with the fallout of their sins? He looked back at the Project 1994 folder. There was one file he hadn't opened yet. It was an audio file, recorded only days before the plane crash. He clicked play. His father's voice, raspy and thin, filled the room. "Elias, if you're hearing this, you've found the truth. You'll think we're monsters. Maybe we are. But you have to understand. Sarah isn't just the girl from the car. There's more. There's a reason she survived when the others didn't. Go to the clinic in Geneva. Ask for Dr. Eris. Mention the code, the debt of blood." The recording cut off. Elias stared at the screen. The investigation wasn't over. It was just beginning. His parents hadn't just left Sarah the money because of a car accident. They had left it because of something that happened after the crash. He grabbed his coat and his car keys. He didn't need 48 hours to pack. He only needed one thing from this house, the truth. The flight to Geneva was a blur of white clouds and black coffee. Elias sat in first class, a cabin he had occupied hundreds of times, but for the first time, he felt like a stowaway. Every luxury, the warm towel, the crystal glass, the attentive nod of the flight attendant felt like a stolen mercy. He kept his father's leather-bound journal pressed against his ribs like a shield, or perhaps a ticking bomb. Geneva was cold. A sharp, medicinal cold that bit through his wool coat and settled in his joints. He didn't check into a hotel. He drove a rented SUV straight toward the mountains, following the GPS coordinates he had found in his father's Project 1994 files. The Clinique de la Croix Argent was not a hospital for the public. It was a glass and steel fortress perched on a cliffside, a place where the world's elite came to hide their addictions, their aging, and their sins. Elias walked into the lobby, the sound of his leather boots echoing on the white marble. A receptionist with a face as frozen as the landscape looked up. "I'm here to see Dr. Eris," Elias said, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. "I have a code, the debt of blood." The receptionist's professional mask didn't slip, but her eyes darkened. She didn't ask for ID. She didn't ask for an appointment. She simply stood up and gestured toward a private elevator. "The doctor has been expecting a thorn for a long time. He just didn't know which one would arrive first." Dr. Eris was a man who looked like he had been carved out of ivory. He was nearly 80, with hands that trembled slightly until he picked up a medical instrument, at which point they became as steady as a surgeon's blade. His office was filled with anatomical models and jars of preserved tissue, lit by the harsh, blue light of the alpine sun reflecting off the glaciers outside. "Elias Thorne," Eris said, not rising from his chair. "You look remarkably like your father. Especially around the eyes." Arthur always did have the look of a man who was perpetually waiting for the floor to give way. "My father is dead," Elias said, sitting opposite him. "And he left me a riddle. He said I owe a debt of blood to Sarah Miller. Tell me what happened in 1994. Dr. Eris sighed and pulled a heavy, velvet-bound ledger from his desk drawer. This was the ledger of sins Elias had been searching for. It wasn't a book of stories, it was a book of data. "In 1994, Elias, you were 3 years old," Eris began, his voice a dry whisper. "And you were dying. You had a rare, aggressive form of childhood leukemia. Your parents spent millions, but the bone marrow registries were empty. No match was found. Not in Europe, not in America." Elias felt a cold chill settle in his stomach. He remembered being sick as a child, vague memories of white rooms and the smell of rubbing alcohol, but he had been told it was a bout of pneumonia. "Your father was a desperate man," Eris continued. "And desperate men do not wait for miracles. They manufacture them. He used his company's resources to illegally access the national birth registries of several countries. He was looking for a genetic doppelganger, someone whose HLA markers were a perfect, 1 in a million match for yours." Elias stopped breathing. "He found Sarah." "He found Sarah Miller," Eris nodded. "A healthy 3-year-old girl living in a small village near the Swiss border. Her father, David Miller, was a brilliant research chemist. A man of ethics. When your father approached him with an offer to buy his daughter's marrow for an undisclosed procedure, David Miller threatened to go to the police and the press. He called your father a monster." Eris opened the ledger to a page dated November 14, 1994. "Your parents didn't mean to kill them," Eris said, though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it. "They went to the Millers' home to plead one last time. To offer more money. But David Miller panicked. He put his wife and daughter in their car and fled into the night, heading for the Italian border. Your father followed. It was a high-speed chase on a mountain road slick with black ice." Elias closed his eyes. He could see it. The black Mercedes tailing the silver sedan. The blinding headlights. The roar of the engines against the silence of the pines. Your father's car clipped their rear bumper, Eris whispered. The miller's car spun out. It crashed through the guardrail and tumbled 50 feet down the ravine. Your father stopped the car. He and your mother climbed down. They found the parents dead, Elias guessed, his voice hollow. Instantly, Eris confirmed. But the girl, Sarah, she was alive. She was strapped into her car seat, screaming. And she was a perfect match for you. The room felt like it was spinning. Elias gripped the edge of the desk. What did they do? They didn't call the police, Eris said, his eyes fixed on Elias. They took her. They unbuckled her from the wreckage of her parents' lives and brought her here, to this clinic. I was the chief of medicine. Your father paid for the entire wing to be closed. We performed the marrow extraction that very night while she was still in shock. We took what you needed to live, Elias. And then, when the procedure was done, your mother couldn't bring herself to kill the girl or leave her in the woods. So they dumped her, Elias whispered, a wave of nausea hitting him. They left her at a church orphanage in a different canton, 3 hours away. They wiped her identity. They made sure she was adopted by a family who knew nothing of her past. And then they went to Zurich and checked into a gala, pretending they had been there all night. You received the transplant 2 days later. You lived because she was harvested like a crop. Elias stood up, but his legs felt like water. He looked at his hands, the hands that had grown strong, the blood that had been purified, all because of a girl who had been left in the snow while her parents rotted in a ravine. The blood debt wasn't just a metaphor. He was literally made of her. Her biological essence was flowing through his veins, the silent engine of his survival. The money, Elias said, turning toward the window. The will. It wasn't just guilt. No, Eris said. It was a restitution. Your father realized at the end that every penny he made with the life he stole for you belonged to her. He didn't just leave her the estate, he left her the interest on the 30 years of life he took from her. You were never the heir, Elias. You were the beneficiary of a biological heist. Dr. Eris pushed the ledger toward him. There is a final entry. Your father kept a list of every medical complication Sarah suffered as a child, the phantom pains, the weakened immune system she had for years after the extraction. He watched her struggle while you thrived. He kept this ledger as a record of his debt. Elias picked up the ledger. It was heavy, the weight of 2 lives intertwined by a crime. He thought of Sarah's tired eyes in the lawyer's office. He thought of her nursing scrubs. She had spent her life healing people, never knowing that her own body had been the first thing ever sacrificed to the thorn greed. Elias walked out of the clinic, leaving the cold blue light of Geneva behind. He didn't go to the airport. He drove back toward the Simplon Pass, toward the spot where the guardrail had once been broken. He stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down into the dark, silent ravine. The trees had grown over the spot where the miller's car had fallen. The world had moved on, but the ghosts were still there. He realized now why Sarah had looked at him with such strange familiarity in the boardroom. They weren't strangers. They were more closely related than most siblings. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number Henderson had given him for Sarah Miller. It rang 3 times before she picked up. Hello, her voice was cautious, exhausted. Sarah, Elias said, his voice cracking. It's Elias. I know why. I know everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, a soft, jagged breath. Does it make it any better? She asked. Knowing. No, Elias said, looking down at the ledger in his hand. It makes it much, much worse. But I'm coming back. And I'm not coming back to fight you for the house. I'm coming back to help you burn it down. The iron gates of Blackwood Manor groaned as Elias pushed them open. He didn't use his remote, he wanted to feel the resistance of the metal, the weight of the barrier that had kept the world out and the Thorn secrets in for 3 decades. The gravel driveway, usually pristine, was littered with dead leaves and soaked by the unrelenting British drizzle. The house loomed ahead, a sprawling, Gothic revival nightmare of grey stone and ivy. As a child, Elias had thought it was a castle. Now, he saw it for what it truly was, a mausoleum built with the interest on a stolen life. He entered the foyer. The 48-hour deadline was nearly up. Technically, he was a trespasser now. He expected to find the house empty, but the scent of Earl Grey tea drifted from the kitchen, a humble, domestic smell that felt alien in the cold, museum-like halls. He found Sarah Miller sitting at the heavy oak kitchen table. She wasn't using the fine bone china or the silver spoons. She had a chipped ceramic mug she must have brought from her own apartment, and she was staring at a stack of legal documents Henderson had left for her. She looked up as Elias entered. She didn't flinch. She just looked tired, the kind of tiredness that bone marrow transplants and 30 years of being a living dead can cause. "You came back," she said softly. "I went to Geneva," Elias replied. He didn't sit. He felt he no longer had the right to sit in this house. He placed the leather-bound ledger from Dr. Aris on the table between them. "I know about the clinic. I know about the harvesting." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the ledger. She opened it to the page dated November 14, 1994. She scanned the medical shorthand, the white blood cell counts, the sedation levels, the volume of marrow extracted from a 3-year-old girl who had just lost her parents in a ravine. "I always wondered why I had these scars on my hips," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My adoptive parents told me they were from the car accident. They said the doctors had to perform surgeries to save my legs. I spent my whole life thanking God for the doctors who saved me." She looked up at Elias, her eyes brimming with a terrifying clarity. "But they didn't save me, did they? They used me to save you. I was a biological spare part." "Yes," Elias said, the word tasting like ash. "I am the reason you were left in an orphanage. I am the reason you grew up without a name. Every breath I've taken for 30 years was bought with the pain they put you through while you were still in shock from your parents' deaths." "There's more," Elias said. "The note my mother left, it said the truth was buried under the mountain. But there's a second truth buried in this house." He led her out of the kitchen and up the grand staircase. They bypassed the master bedroom and went to the far end of the north wing, to a room that had always been locked, Arthur Thorne's private archive. Elias used the key he had taken from his father's study. The door creaked open, revealing a room that was not filled with ledgers or business files, but with photographs. Sarah gasped, leaning against the door frame for support. The walls were covered in hundreds of candid photos. Sarah at 5 years old, playing in a park in Bristol. Sarah at 12, receiving a middle school award. Sarah at 18, moving into her first university dorm. Sarah in her nursing scrubs, walking into St. Jude's Hospital. There were boxes of her hair ribbons, copies of her school reports, and even a dried flower from her graduation bouquet. "They didn't just pay for your life," Elias said, his voice thick with horror. "They stalked you. They watched every moment of the life they stole from you. It wasn't just guilt, Sarah. It was a sick, twisted obsession. They were making sure their investment was thriving." Sarah walked into the center of the room, turning in circles. Her life, which she thought was her own private, difficult, and earned through hard work, had been a television show for the monsters who killed her parents. "They were right here," she whispered, touching a photo of herself crying at a bus stop when she was 20. "They were watching me be lonely. They were watching me struggle to pay rent, while they sat in this palace and drank wine." She turned to Elias, her grief suddenly sharpening into a cold, jagged rage. "And you? Did you know? Did you watch too? No, Elias said, dropping to his knees. I was the fool they did it all for. I was the prince of a kingdom built on your blood, and I was too blind to see the cracks in the walls. I thought I was special. I thought I was Thorn because of my merit. But I'm just a parasite, Sarah. I'm a parasite that lived inside you, and then lived on top of you. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone of the manor. Sarah looked at the photos, then at the man kneeling before her. She saw the gold watch on his wrist, the expensive suit, and the face that belonged to the boy she had saved without ever being asked. Henderson told me that if I sign the final papers tonight, the Thorn Empire becomes mine, Sarah said. The labs, the patents, the money. All of it? It's yours, Elias said. Every cent. I've already contacted the board. I'm resigning. I'm vacating the estate. I have £50,000 in a personal account, the only thing they left me. I'm going to use it to find the families of the other people Thorn Global stepped on over the years. Sarah walked over to a window that looked out over the vast, rolling hills of the estate. You think giving me this house fixes it? You think money can buy back the sound of my mother's voice? Or the memory of my father's face? They took my past, Elias. And they turned my present into a lie. She turned back to him, her eyes hard. I don't want the Thorn name. I don't want the Thorn legacy. I want to destroy it. Then let's do it, Elias said, standing up. The company is built on patents derived from the research my father stole from your father's notes after the crash. I found the files in Geneva. He didn't just take your marrow, he took your father's life's work. Elias walked to the wall and tore down a photo of Sarah as a child. We don't just sign the papers. We go public. We tell the world what Thorn Global is actually made of. We liquidate the assets, settle the debts, and turn the manor into a memorial for the people who died so this family could live. Sarah looked at the ledger, then at the gallery of her stolen life. For the first time, she saw Elias not as the enemy, but as the other victim of Arthur and Eleanor Thorn. He was the one they had turned into a living lie. They wanted us to play our parts, Sarah said. I was supposed to be the grateful orphan who inherited a fortune, and you were supposed to be the tragic son who lost everything. They wanted their guilt to be settled with a check. She stepped closer to him, her voice a low, dangerous hum. But we aren't going to play our parts. We're going to give them the one thing they were most afraid of. What's that? Elias asked. The truth, told by the two people they tried to own. Sarah picked up a heavy silver trophy from a shelf, an award Arthur Thorn had won for ethics in business. She handed it to Elias. The deadline is in 6 hours, she said. The lawyers are coming at midnight to finalize the transfer. Before they get here, I want to clear this room. I want every photo, every ribbon, every memory they stole burned in the fireplace downstairs. Elias took the trophy. He looked at his reflection in the polished silver, the reflection of a man who was finally beginning to see himself clearly. And then? He asked. And then, Sarah said, a dark, vengeful smile touching her lips, we invite the press. We tell them why the Thorns left everything to a stranger. And we make sure that by tomorrow morning, the name Thorn is worth absolutely nothing. As they began to tear the photos from the walls, the rain outside finally stopped. But inside Blackwood Manor, the storm was just beginning. The living debt was being called in, and the interest was going to be paid in fire. Midnight arrived not with a chime, but with the crunch of gravel beneath the tires of heavy black sedans. The lawyers, led by Marcus Henderson, stepped out into the damp night air, clutching briefcases filled with the paperwork that would officially transfer one of the largest private fortunes in Europe to a woman they considered a lucky stranger. Behind them, however, were 3 unmarked vans, the uninvited guests Elias had summoned. The press. the investigative journalists who had spent decades trying to pierce the thorn veil and had always failed. Inside the manor, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and burnt chemical gloss. Elias and Sarah stood in the grand library. The fireplace was a roaring beast, fed by the hundreds of photographs, hair ribbons, and school reports that had made up the stocking room. The flickering orange light danced across their faces, casting long, jagged shadows against the rows of leather-bound books that Arthur Thorne had bought but never read. "Are you ready?" Elias asked. He looked older than he had 48 hours ago. The sharp, arrogant edge of his jaw had softened into something more weary, more human. Sarah watched a photo of her 7-year-old self curl into black ash. "I've spent my whole life feeling like a ghost in my own skin, Elias. Tonight, I finally want to be solid." The library doors swung open. Henderson walked in, followed by 4 grim-faced executors. They stopped dead, their eyes darting from the roaring fire to the disheveled state of the golden heir and the nurse-turned-billionaire. "Elias? What is this?" Henderson demanded, his voice tight. "The press is outside. Why are there cameras at the gate? This was supposed to be a private transition." "The transition is over, Marcus," Elias said, stepping forward. He didn't look like a thorn. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of a heavy suit that didn't fit. "We aren't here to sign the papers you prepared. We're here to sign the ones we prepared." Sarah stepped into the light, holding the ledger of sins and the medical records from the Geneva clinic. "You knew," she said to Henderson, her voice a calm, terrifying blade. "You were the one who notarized the Project 1994 files. You knew my parents were run off a road. You knew my body was harvested while I was in a state of shock. You helped them buy my silence before I was old enough to speak." Henderson's face turned the color of the ash in the grate. "It was a matter of family preservation. Your parents were dead, Sarah. The Thorns provided for you. They gave you a future. They gave me a cage made of gold." Sarah shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "They watched me through lenses like I was a lab rat. They stole my marrow to save their son, and then they stole my privacy to ease their guilt." The cameras began to roll. Elias had let the journalists into the foyer, and they stood at the library's threshold, capturing the moment the Thorn Empire began to implode. Elias turned to the cameras, his voice steady. "My name is Elias Thorne. For 30 years, I have lived a life that was paid for with the blood of David and Mary Miller. My parents were not philanthropists. They were criminals. Thorne Global Holdings was built on research stolen from a dying man and sustained by the silence of an orphaned girl." He looked at Sarah, then back at the lens. "Tonight, Thorne Global ceases to exist as a family entity. Sarah Miller, the rightful heir to the brilliance my father stole, is liquidating the company. Every patent, every lab, and every cent of the Thorne fortune is being moved into a blind trust." The lawyers began to protest, shouting about fiduciary duties and board approvals, but Sarah silenced them with a single document. It was a confession signed by Eleanor Thorne on her deathbed, witnessed by a nurse at the hospital, a document Elias had found tucked inside his mother's jewelry box earlier that evening. "The money is going back," Sarah told the world. "To the families whose land was seized for Thorne factories. To the patients who were overcharged for the medicines my father didn't actually invent. And to the orphans of the 1994 Simplon Pass Accident Fund." The fallout was instantaneous. By dawn, the news had circled the globe. The Thorne horror was the only headline. Stock prices for Thorne Global didn't just drop, they evaporated. The board of directors resigned in a frantic wave of self-preservation. Elias watched from the front steps of the manor as the movers paid for by Sarah began to take the furniture away. Not to a new house, but to auction houses. Every painting, every statue, every piece of silver was to be sold. He had nothing left. His personal accounts had been frozen as part of the investigation into his father's offshore Project 1994 fund. He had a suitcase, a few changes of clothes, and the £50,000 his parents had left him, which he had already signed over to the Miller estate. Sarah walked out onto the terrace. She was wearing her old wool coat. She looked like the nurse from the lawyer's office again, but the tired weight in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, crystalline peace. "Where will you go?" she asked him. Elias looked out over the hills. "Away from here. I have a friend who runs a small clinic in a village in the north. They need someone to handle the logistics, the paperwork. It's a quiet life. I think I'd like to try being a person whose name doesn't mean anything to anyone." Sarah nodded. "I'm turning the manor into a center for medical ethics. A place where they teach doctors that a life can't be measured in a ledger. We're naming it after my parents. The Miller Center." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver key. The key to the manor's front door. She looked at it for a moment, then dropped it into Elias's hand. "Keep it," she said. "Not as an owner, but as a reminder. You were the boy who lived because I bled. But from now on, Elias, you're the man who lives because he chose to tell the truth." The village in the north was a place of grey stone and green moss, far from the mahogany boardrooms of London. Elias sat in a small cafe, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. He spent his days organizing supply chains for rural clinics, ensuring that life-saving medicine got to people who couldn't afford a Thorne global price tag. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery. He was, for the first time in his life, happy. His phone buzzed. It was a news alert. The Miller Foundation completes its first year of operations. Over 500 cold cases of corporate malpractice settled. Sarah Miller named Person of the Year for her work in medical transparency. There was a photo of Sarah. She was standing in front of the manor, now the Miller Center, surrounded by children. She looked radiant. Elias smiled and put his phone away. He looked at his hands. They were the same hands he had always had, but they no longer felt like they belonged to a parasite. The blood in his veins was still hers, but the life he was living was finally his own. His parents had left everything to a stranger in their will. They thought they were paying a debt. They thought they were buying forgiveness. But they hadn't realized that the stranger was the only person who could actually set their son free. The weight of the crown was gone. In its place was the lightness of being nothing, and in being nothing, Elias Thorne had finally found everything.